Her Majesty, the Queen, has asked me to form a new administration, and I have accepted.
May the 4th, 1979, Britain's first woman Prime Minister on the threshold of 10 Downing Street.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
Margaret Thatcher, at the beginning of 11 and a half unbroken years as Prime Minister, a commanding figure in British public life, a leader who rewrote the domestic political agenda and helped reshape the post-Cold War world.
She had an absolutely clear vision of what she wanted to do, which we all agreed with. But she had the courage of her convictions and inspired us with the courage to do it.
Kenneth Clarke was a minister in Mrs Thatcher's government throughout her years in power.
We did things which half the cabinet would have said, oh, this is not politically possible in the Britain of the 1980s. She got us all to do it. It was conviction politics. And what Margaret Thatcher did to her colleagues like me was to give us the courage of our convictions.
That sense of mission was accompanied by a domineering personality. She was an alpha female, in the words of the political commentator Anne McElvoy.
She was a radical who courted controversy and at times even opposition and dislike if it furthered her goals. For some people, she's someone who accelerated the deindustrialisation of large parts of Britain and showed very little remorse for that. Of course, for other people, she was the woman who saved Britain, who got it out of the terrible feeling in the 1970s that Britain was becoming a second-class nation, who gave it back a sense of pride in itself, and who showed that you could do considerable political reform that would have a very quick impact on your country, and indeed a lasting one.
Thatcherism, a term which bore witness to her political dominance, was not really an ideology. It reflected policies and as much her political determination, an emphasis on reducing the role of the state and achieving fiscal discipline, and on the international stage, an approach to diplomacy described by her detractors as handbagging. She forged strong alliances with Washington and, more surprisingly, with a reform-minded leader in Moscow, but she made enemies as well.
She did not suffer fools gladly. So you had to yourself be intelligent. But she was also a good listener.
As Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, Sir Sridhar Ramphal, Sonny Ramphal, had the tricky task of persuading Margaret Thatcher to support sanctions against apartheid South Africa.
I liked Mrs. Thatcher. And she had moments when she was very gracious, when she was very willing to talk. But Mrs. Thatcher came to Southern African issues out of a very parochial background. And for her, from the beginning, it was a learning process. As a human being, I found that she carried the initial conviction too far.
Those convictions were rooted in her background. Margaret Thatcher was the epitome of Middle England, not from the elite, not from old money, but part of the make-your-own-way middle class. The daughter of a shopkeeper and staunch Methodist, brought up in the small market town of Grantham. At Oxford University, she studied chemistry. She had a close and companionate marriage. Dennis Thatcher was a successful businessman, and they had twins, Mark and Carol. By her mid-30s, she was a Member of Parliament. By her mid-40s, Education Minister. In 1975, she became Conservative Party leader. An outsider, but her radical agenda won through. 4 years later, she became Britain's first woman Prime Minister, and in a position to practice what she preached. Her biographer, the late Hugo Young.
She was a genuine right-wing politician. Only when she became leader of the party and subsequently Prime Minister was she able to give full voice to what she thought of as the way in which a free Britain should develop, which was somewhat anti-state, believing in people standing on their own 2 feet, believing in the individual, and developing an economic policy and a social policy based on that philosophy.
When we took over, we were a bit of an economic laughingstock. The morale of the nation was rock bottom. So the country was in a bad way in 1979, in my view. And she by sheer determination, actually, inspired everybody with a bit of self-confidence, took some very dramatic decisions, changed the way we earned our living around the country. And it was very rumbustious, but she changed the place very much for the better over the next 10 years.
It was a painful prescription, cuts in public spending and a shakeout of industry. The watchword, Tina. There is no alternative. As unemployment rose sharply, the street started to echo to another defining phrase of the 1980s.
Maggie, Maggie, Maggie! Maggie!
It wasn't just the trade unions. The Church of England, academia, a large part of the old establishment were ranged against her. But Margaret Thatcher was determined not to repeat what she saw as the error of earlier governments in making an about-turn on economic policy when the going got tough.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
Her robust stand on the economy paved the way for what she called popular capitalism, the privatisation of state-owned enterprises and lower personal taxes. In time, it became the new political orthodoxy. She championed what she called Victorian values, above all the family. That struck a chord. Many among the middle class and the aspiring working class became fervent Thatcher supporters. In the inner cities, she was much less popular. And as recession deepened, the social fabric there began to tear.
Crouched behind their riot shields, the police withstood many such barrages of bottles, bricks and petrol bombs during the 5 hours the rioting lasted. When there was a lull, they advanced, first giving ominous warning of their intentions by drumming on their riot shields with their truncheons.
The Toxteth riots in Liverpool, she did say to one of her staff, who told me about it, when she watched on the television, her very first reaction on seeing television pictures of riots was, "Oh, those poor shopkeepers." An eloquent expression, not entirely discreditable, but an interesting expression of her priorities.
Hugo Young. Mrs. Thatcher rode out the riots, but her support in the opinion polls slumped. She was saved in part by a national emergency abroad. When Argentina invaded some tiny specks on the globe, the British-ruled and populated Falkland Islands, Margaret Thatcher sent a naval task force halfway around the world to win them back.
Steaming gently at first, but with gathering force, HMS Invincible was the first to put to sea.
I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them all out, and I counted them all back. Their pilots were unhurt, cheerful and jubilant, giving thumbs-up signs.
The commander of the operation has sent the following message. Be pleased to inform Her Majesty that the White Ensign flies alongside the Union Jack in South Georgia. God save the Queen.
The Falklands War was a very personal victory. Mrs. Thatcher reaped the electoral dividend. In 1983, she won a second term in power with a much increased majority. She now had the mandate and the confidence to push ahead with the next part of her political agenda, to tame the trade unions. The National Union of Mine Workers was among the most militant. A decade earlier, it had brought down the previous Conservative government. It was now led by the firebrand socialist Arthur Scargill.
This demonstration should be used as a demonstration of solidarity against the pit closure programme.
Just months after Mrs. Thatcher's second election victory, Arthur Scargill called his members out on strike. The Prime Minister stuck to her guns. We had to fight an enemy without in the Falklands, she declared. We always have to be aware of the enemy within, which is more difficult to fight and more dangerous to liberty. Of all her battles, this was the most bitter.
It became obvious men were seriously ill, in danger of their lives. They were laid out on the ground, and I saw one policeman run forward from the line, very vulnerable, alone among the pickets, to try to make space around the injured and get them to safety.
and the message, we won't go back.
But after a year, the miners did go back to work, defeated.
There'd have been neither freedom nor order in Britain if we'd given in to violence. There'd have been no hope for any prosperous industry if people had gone on strike, really, for bigger and bigger subsidies from the taxpayers.
The enemy abroad, the enemy at home, both had been humbled. But Mrs. Thatcher also faced another enemy, much more personally menacing, the IRA.
Most of the residents were asleep. Some were still socialising in the bars as the hotel was ripped apart. Beneath the debris, dozens of people lay buried. One question, was the Prime Minister safe?
In the autumn of 1984, Margaret Thatcher narrowly escaped death when Irish Republicans detonated a massive bomb in her party conference hotel.
The bomb went off somewhere between 2:45 and 3. I know that because I looked up when I'd finished something at 2:45, and I just turned to do one final paper. And then it went off. My husband was in bed, and all the windows went.
5 people were killed. 2 members of her cabinet were seriously injured. Margaret Thatcher would not be bowed.
The bomb attack on the Grand Hotel early this morning was first and foremost an inhuman, undiscriminating attempt to massacre innocent, unsuspecting men and women staying in Brighton for our Conservative conference.
She went ahead with her conference speech as planned just hours after the bomb attack, a powerful demonstration of her political courage.
The fact that we are gathered here now, shocked, but composed and determined, is a sign not only that this attack has failed, but that all attempts to destroy democracy by terrorism will fail.
There was a sense of resolve, of certainty. It made her impatient, contemptuous sometimes of those who did not share her outlook. Is he one of us, was the question she sometimes asked privately about political colleagues. This steeliness of approach extended to Margaret Thatcher's outlook on the world. She had little expertise in foreign policy before entering Downing Street, but she believed fervently that the Western world must face down the communist threat. The Soviet Union responded by bestowing on her a title intended as a put-down, but one which she relished.
I stand before you tonight in my red star chiffon evening gown, my face softly made up and my fair hair gently waved. The Iron Lady of the Western world.
The Iron Lady attracted more acclaim abroad than at home, as Ken Clarke recalled.
She was always far more popular in America than she ever was in the United Kingdom, and far more popular behind the United Curtain than she ever was, the Iron Curtain, than she ever was in the United Kingdom. I mean, in Poland and in the United States, she had popularity ratings which she could only dream of in Britain. She was again so forceful that she did have an effect, although sometimes she got herself isolated. But her relationship with Ronnie Reagan, as far as I could judge, was very genuine.
They were political soulmates, an alliance which really did change the world. Their first encounter was in 1980, just before Ronald Reagan entered the White House.
I met her in her office, and I think the meeting ran about an hour and a half. We were discussing everything from economics to our ideas of what the role government should play and all, and I was greatly impressed by her. And I was later questioned by some about what I had thought, and I expressed my belief that she would make a magnificent prime minister.
Whether it was upgrading nuclear missiles, bombing Libya, or beating back the evil empire, Ronald Reagan's description of the Soviet Union and its allies, Britain and the United States stood shoulder to shoulder. George Shultz was President Reagan's Secretary of State. He acknowledged the key role of Margaret Thatcher in East-West relations.
Central. A very good thinker about the importance of being strong and also the importance of being willing to negotiate on the basis of strength. And as Mr. Gorbachev appeared on the scene, she was the first leader to recognize that here was somebody that we at least should talk to. And I think her initial perception turned out to be right.
I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together. We both believe in our own political systems. He firmly believes in his, I firmly believe in mine. We're never going to change one another.
But she did help to change the Soviet bloc. Moscow's tentacles loosened, the Warsaw Pact fell apart, the Berlin Wall came down. A new Europe took shape, and a new generation of East European politicians, among them Andrzej Zawielawski, came to Britain to say thank you.
I am from Poland. You know, in my country, very, very soon we came to the conclusion that socialism cannot be improved. It must be removed. Now we are trying to privatize our economy. I hope we will also succeed, because our guide is your Prime Minister.
Not a view shared by many in the old Europe, who found Margaret Thatcher difficult to deal with. Some Western European leaders regarded her as a reluctant European, as she battled to reduce Britain's contribution to the European Union's budget. Ken Clarke found her respected but unloved in European capitals.
She was a big figure. She wasn't very popular. I mean, I knew enough European politicians to know they regarded her with a sense of dread and dislike. I don't think she ever got quite right. She'd have done better if she'd been less aggressive. And she couldn't stand Helmut Kohl, and he couldn't stand her. She got on very badly with Mitterrand. They patronised her, and they were a bit sexist, and so on. But she was not to be underrated.
We have not successfully rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain, only to see them reimposed at a European level, with a European superstate exercising a new dominance from Brussels.
That speech at Bruges gave expression to Margaret Thatcher's concern that Europe was adopting the socialist, corporatist approach that she had so diligently dismantled in Britain. It was, argues her biographer Hugo Young, a reflection of her abiding distrust of European political union.
I always thought that she, in a way, went back to childhood experiences which had always been important to her, namely her attitude to the Germans. Originally, it was what had happened to her and her family and the bombers going over during the war and the formative memories of the Germans, which had always made her a cautious European. But I think she never got rid of those feelings, hostile feelings, Europhobic feelings.
Many in her Conservative Party were alarmed by her Eurosceptic tone. She suffered bitter rows with former political allies. Her party began to split. The hammer blow came when her mild-mannered deputy, Sir Geoffrey Howe, walked out, attacking what he called the nightmare vision of his boss.
We seem sometimes to look out upon a continent that is positively teeming with ill-intentioned people, scheming, in her words, to extinguish democracy, to dissolve our national identities, to lead us through the back door into a federal Europe.
And even more wounding, he used a cricketing metaphor to tear apart Margaret Thatcher's style of leadership.
It's rather like sending your opening batsmen to the crease, only for them to find, the moment the first balls are bowled, that their bats have been broken before the game by the team captain.
These stark divisions over Europe, the unease about her imperious style, were compounded by her least successful policy at home. The poll tax was an attempt to redress a problem felt deeply by her natural supporters, replacing the property taxes which funded local government. It provoked a political crisis and the most serious rioting in central London for a century.
There are cans and bottles and stones flying. They're turning towards a few police officers, one's on the ground. They look in a bad way. Police on horseback now, riding up through Trafalgar Square, and people are throwing sticks and stones and bottles at them. They're galloping through in a line.
There is no excuse ever for people turning to violence. None whatsoever. This is a country with a vigorous parliament and fair and just courts.
Margaret Thatcher could not be persuaded to back down. But the combination of an unpopular poll tax and acute divisions over Europe made many in her party fear that she was losing her political touch. In November 1990, she was challenged for the party leadership by a long-standing pro-Europe rival, Michael Heseltine.
I am persuaded that I would have a better chance now, a better prospect now, than Mrs. Thatcher, of leading the Conservatives into a fourth electoral victory and thus avoiding the ultimate calamity of a Labour government.
In a ballot of Conservative MPs, Margaret Thatcher came out on top, but not by a sufficient margin to win outright. A mortal political wound. Her instinct was to fight on, but within a couple of days she'd been persuaded to change her mind. Sir Bernard Ingham, her pugnaciously loyal press secretary, was at her side as the political tide turned.
It was conceived that she should see members of the cabinet separately, which turned out to be not a good idea, because I think most people feel that if indeed she'd have set about them, as she did of old, in concert, all together, they would have been cowed. At any rate, she saw members of the cabinet, and I guess it was about 8:30 p.m. I went into the cabinet room and she said, they're all deserting me.
I knew she was in terrible difficulty. We had a robust conversation. It wasn't a row, but I did say that, much though I regretted to have to say it, she was going to be defeated and she should accept reality.
She looked awful, very close to tears. And it must be said that Margaret Thatcher did not cry a lot. She wasn't a crybaby at all, and therefore you knew very well that if she was in a tearful mood, things were very bad indeed.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11 and a half wonderful years, and we're very happy that we leave the United Kingdom in a very, very much better state than when we came here 11 and a half years ago. It's been a tremendous privilege. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
A political regicide. Margaret Thatcher was evicted from office, not by the voters, but by her own party. Hugo Young.
In the end, the country couldn't stand being hectored and lectured at, and nor could the Tory party, and therefore they inflicted on her this extraordinarily unusual thing, having won 3 elections, and before another election had come along, they sacked her.
Margaret Thatcher did not take easily to the loss of office. A seat in the House of Lords was little compensation. She was an awkward presence for her successors as party leader. The manner of her overthrow also caused lasting discord within the Conservative Party, and it paid a heavy price, with long years out of office. The political commentator Anne McElvoy.
It did take the Conservative Party a long time to escape her shadow because she was such a dominant figure. I think within the modern Conservative Party she's viewed with a mixture of admiration and a certain caution about not getting too much caught up in the reputation of being Thatcher's children. But an awful lot of work has gone into rebranding the Conservative Party to be kinder, to be more humane, and also to have perhaps greater outreach than Mrs. Thatcher had.
David Cameron came to power promising what he called a big society, where Margaret Thatcher had once declared there's no such thing as society. He is socially liberal, where she was traditionalist. But David Cameron's Conservatives have imbibed from Mrs. Thatcher a sceptical approach to Europe, a distrust of the state, and an emphasis on market economics. At his first party conference as Prime Minister in October 2010, he expressed his debt to his predecessor.
It is impossible to pay tribute to previous leaders of this party without mentioning the greatest peacetime Prime Minister of the last century. Next week, Margaret Thatcher celebrates her 85th birthday, and I'm pleased to say she'll be doing it in number 10 Downing Street, and I know everyone in this hall will want to sell her many happy returns.
Poor health prevented Margaret Thatcher from making that birthday party. Her final years were clouded by dementia. Her husband, Dennis, had died in 2003. A sad end for such a proud political figure. Love her or loathe her, nobody could deny the importance of her legacy. Her biographer, Hugo Young.
Margaret Thatcher did change this country. She was a Prime Minister and this can't be said of all of them, who made a deep impact which won't be forgotten. Her sense that this country, in the decade in which she was in power, did change from being one which embraced almost unthinkingly the social democratic consensus of the post-war years and moved, however unwillingly, to look towards a different sort of future, which became the future that most other countries in the industrialized world wanted to aspire to.
What those who knew her, who worked with her, who reported on her political career remember most vividly is the force of her personality, her stamina, discipline and determination, her unquestioned courage, that sense of mission. Whatever you thought of her, no one was indifferent to Margaret Thatcher.